Every iconic photograph of the Chrysler building going up in 1928 tells the same story. The danger was the height. But the deadliest thing on that construction site was not the drop to the street. It was the loose, reused wooden planks laid across open steel beams inside the rising tower. These were temporary floors that every four-man rivet crew crossed dozens of times a shift. Uninspected, unregulated, built to no standard, those boards turned routine movement into a daily gamble with gravity. The workers who fell through them were almost never counted. A desperate race to build the world's tallest skyscraper was about to make every step more dangerous. In the autumn of 1928, New York's skyline became a battleground. The Chrysler building broke ground in September, and from the very start, speed was everything. Architect William Van Allen promised not just a skyscraper, but the world's tallest, an Art Deco spire that would outpace the Bank of Manhattan Trust building by any means necessary. Turner Construction, under pressure from both Van Allen and Walter Chrysler himself, pledged a schedule that bordered on reckless: 4 new floors every week, steel rising faster than the concrete could set. Newspapers tracked every stage like a sporting event, splashing headlines about the dizzying race skyward and the men who seemed to dance with death on the open beams. Yet inside the growing skeleton, the real contest was not against gravity or rival architects. It was against the clock. Deadlines left no room for slow, cautious work. Permanent floors lagged behind the steel. To keep pace, crews laid down makeshift wooden planks. Rough, reused boards stretched across open gaps, forming temporary floors that shifted as the building climbed. These platforms were never meant for comfort or even true safety. They were a compromise, a gamble taken so the project could keep its promise to the press and to Chrysler's ambition. At street level, the public marveled at the spectacle. Men perched on the building's crown, silhouetted against the sky. But most of the danger was hidden inside, where every step onto a creaking plank was a test of nerve and luck. The urgency to finish first meant that boards were reused, often long past their prime, and inspections were little more than a glance from a hurried foreman. The city's building code offered vague guidance, guardrails and nets for the heights, but nothing for the patchwork decks beneath. For the men inside, the race was not just about reaching the top. It was about surviving the floor beneath their boots, day after day, as the city watched the skyline change and never saw the real risk unfolding behind the steel and stone. The courage remembered in photographs was not just about daring the wind, it was about trusting the next step, even when the ground itself could not be trusted. Inside the Chrysler building's unfinished shell, temporary floors took shape from rough 2 by 10-inch planks, each stretching 10 to 14 feet. Oak was always the first choice, dense, strong, and slow to split. But the city's appetite outpaced the forests. When oak ran out, pine filled the gaps. Pine boards, lighter and easier to handle, arrived in stacks from sawmills in Brooklyn or the Bronx, sometimes sticky with sap, sometimes already scarred by use. The difference was clear to anyone who stepped on them. Oak felt solid underfoot. Pine flexed and sometimes cracked with little warning. As soon as a steel floor was set, crews laid these boards side by side, bolting them to beams with steel brackets when time allowed, or wedging them in place if the schedule pressed. Where beams stretched more than 4 feet apart, a web of lighter steel or timber called cage scaffolding caught the boards, keeping them from bowing under weight. There was never enough lumber to cover an entire floor at once. Instead, planks overlapped in a shifting patchwork, their ends staggered to avoid long, unsupported runs. The surface looked almost complete, but moved with every step, creaking and flexing beneath the boots of men who learned to read the wood by feel. The boards rarely stayed in one place for long. As the steel skeleton rose, the same planks were pried loose, hoisted by crane, and relaid on the next level. A single board might climb 4 or 5 stories in a week, each trip leaving it more worn. Foremen kept simple logs tracking which boards had been used and when, but in the rush, even planks with hairline cracks or water stains often stayed in service. Only when a board was clearly unsafe, marked with a red chalk line, was it set aside. And this happened less often than safety rules suggested. For the men above the city, trust in the plank beneath them was instinctive, built from experience and necessity. The temporary floor was always changing, shaped by weather, wear, and the relentless drive to build higher. A 10-foot wooden plank, just 2 inches thick, could look solid in the half-light of the Chrysler building's unfinished floors. But strength on paper meant little when the wood was old, wet, or battered by weeks of use. These planks, spanning steel beams high above the city, were the only thing between a worker and a fatal drop. The danger wasn't always dramatic. A single misstep, a hairline split, or a board flexing under too much weight could turn a routine crossing into disaster. Engineering journals from the late 1920s spelled out the risks. Sheer failure was the most sudden. Too much load and the plank snapped clean through, often without warning. Flexural sag crept in over days or weeks as the board bowed under repeated footsteps, its fibers slowly giving way. Hidden splits, sometimes invisible from above, ran along the grain, waiting for the vibration of a rivet gun or a shift in weight to split the board wide open. Each failure mode was a silent threat, lurking beneath the surface. The American Institute of Steel Construction's 1928 manual set the safe load for a 2x10 oak plank at 2,400 pounds over a 12-foot span. In theory, that covered 5 men and a crate of steel plates, but those numbers assumed new, dry lumber. In reality, planks were reused, soaked by rain, and weakened by hammer blows. When oak ran short, pine was pressed into service, softer, more prone to sagging and splitting. Engineering News Record published warnings about overloading and vibration fatigue, but the relentless pace on the Chrysler site left little time for careful inspection. Planks were rarely fastened at both ends. A single loose board could slide off its beam if a load landed too hard or a gust of wind rattled the frame. Vibration from tools and footsteps worked tiny cracks deeper into the wood. Official guidelines called for staggered planks, supported every 4 feet. But the reality was a patchwork. The real risk wasn't the dizzying height, but the ordinary board underfoot, weathered, overloaded, and trusted far beyond its design. 8 hours at a stretch, 4 men moved as one. Across the shifting wooden planks inside the Chrysler building's rising frame. Each crew was a patchwork of stories. Irishmen from Hell's Kitchen, sons of Sicilian masons, second-generation Pennsylvanians who traded coal dust for city air. They did not see themselves as daredevils. They were breadwinners, young and strong, their hands calloused from years of work in steel and stone. Most were in their 20s or 30s, some barely out of apprenticeship, all bound together by the rhythm of the job and the unspoken trust that the next step would hold. A shift began before dawn when the city below was still dark. The foreman would walk the deck, tapping each board with a hammer, listening for the sound that meant safe or suspect. The tap test was quick, more ritual than guarantee. After that, work started, rivet guns hammering, buckets of bolts clanging onto the planks, men shouting instructions in a mix of English, Italian, and Irish slang. Lunch came on the same boards, boots dangling over the edge, backs pressed to the steel. There was no cafeteria, no shelter from wind or rain. The floor beneath was just as likely to flex or creak as it was to hold steady, so meals were eaten with one eye on the grain of the wood and the other on the next task. Routine made the danger invisible. Men learned to read the subtle signs, a board that bounced a little too much, a knot that split under a heel, the faint give that meant water had soaked through. They watched each other's steps, calling out if a plank looked suspect, but there were no harnesses, no nets inside, and no official inspections. The city's code stopped at the edge of the steel. Inside, the rules belonged to the crew and the clock. Most days, nothing happened. But sometimes a misjudged step or a hairline crack sent a man plunging through the patchwork floor. The accident reports, when they were filed at all, often blamed the worker for losing balance or being careless. The truth, hidden in the routine, was that the boards themselves decided who made it home. From street level, the public saw only the silhouettes against the sky, men poised in impossible places. Inside, courage was quieter. It was the act of trusting the plank beneath you, shift after shift, knowing that the greatest danger was not the wind or the height, but the ordinary wood underfoot. The real feat was not just standing tall above Manhattan, but believing every day that the next uncertain step would hold. New York's building code in 1928 spelled out certain dangers but left others in silence. The rules on paper required guardrails at the edge of open floors and nets for the men working high above the street. There were limits on how much weight could be placed on permanent floors and standards for fire escapes and stairwells. Yet buried in the code's dense language, there was barely a mention of the temporary planks that made up the working decks inside the rising Chrysler building. No clause set a maximum load for these makeshift floors. No paragraph demanded that the boards be new or even that they be inspected beyond a foreman's passing glance. The law stopped at the edge of the steel, where the city's concern for safety faded into the background noise of progress. By 1911, the city had updated its building code to address the new realities of skyscraper construction. Section 103 required guardrails for any platform more than 20 feet above the ground. Section 105 mentioned scaffolding, but only in connection with exterior work. Nowhere did the code require a minimum plank thickness, a load test, or a regular inspection of the decks that workers crossed all day, every day. The only official guidance came from a single line: temporary floors shall be provided as the work progresses to afford safe passage for workmen. What counted as safe was left to each contractor's interpretation. There was no federal oversight, no OSHA, no Department of Labor inspectors, no standardized forms to report a near miss or a fatal fall. The city's Department of Buildings might send an inspector to check the permanent structure, but the shifting, overlapping planks inside the frame escaped notice. The result was a vacuum, a space where informal custom replaced formal rule. Foremen decided when a board was too cracked to use. Crews set their own limits on how many men or how much steel could share a span. If a plank failed, the official record often blamed the worker for a misstep, not the absence of clear standards. This legal silence shaped the daily reality inside the Chrysler building. The men who crossed the planks did so under rules that were unwritten and constantly shifting. They learned to trust their balance and their instincts, not the law. The code's gaps made the danger routine, invisible to those who were not there, and easy to dismiss as bad luck or carelessness. Yet behind every step was the knowledge that the law offered little protection. The greatest threat was not the wind at the edge, but the ordinary board beneath their boots, unregulated, untested, and always one load away from giving way. Crane whistles cut through the morning air as another load swung into the Chrysler building's unfinished heart. Each day began with a rhythm dictated by hoist cycles, with steel, tools, and crates of rivets rising floor by floor, all delivered onto the same patchwork of wooden planks that held the men. The logistics team, perched on narrow catwalks, tracked every delivery, knowing that a single miscalculation could tip the balance from organized chaos to outright danger. Material staging was relentless. Hoists ran on tight intervals, often every 15 minutes, and each lift brought more weight than the last. A crate of steel plates could tip the scales at 1,200 pounds, landing with a dull thud on boards already flexing under the weight of men and machinery. The schedule left no time for clearing space. Planks became crowded with tools, buckets, and the next load before the last was even unpacked. The deck sagged and groaned, not just from the workers, but from the constant arrival of new material, an invisible pressure that multiplied the risk with every cycle. Logistics foremen kept rough ledgers, mapping where each crate would land and how long it could sit before blocking the next delivery. But the pace outstripped planning. When a hoist arrived early or a load weighed more than expected, the only solution was to squeeze it onto the nearest open plank. Sometimes that meant stacking crates 2 or 3 deep, pushing the wood past its safe limit. Engineering manuals cautioned against overloading, but on the site, the numbers blurred as the day wore on. A single span might hold 5 men, a full crate, and a pile of tools, well over a ton pressing down on boards designed for half that. The choreography of the crew depended on trust, not just in each other, but in the planks beneath their boots. Every new delivery forced the men to recalculate their steps, shifting their weight, listening for the telltale creak that warned of strain. The real danger wasn't always obvious. It built up with each crate, each hurried shift, each time a load was set down without a second thought. The planks bore more than just human weight. They carried the full burden of the project's ambition, amplifying the risk in ways no one at street level could see. For the men inside, the deadliest threat was not the height, but the silent accumulation of pressure on the boards that kept them aloft. Inside the Chrysler building, the Rivet gang moved as a single organism. 4 men, the heater, the catcher, the bucker, and the riveter, worked in a tight square, boots planted on planks that shifted with every step. Their routine was a kind of choreography, each motion tuned to the rhythm of steel and wood. The heater, crouched by a portable furnace, pulled glowing rivets from the fire and tossed them across the gap, sometimes 10 feet, into a waiting can. The catcher snatched each red-hot rivet from the air, balancing on a board that flexed beneath him, then turned to the bucker, who braced the steel from behind. The riveter hammered it home, each blow sending a shudder through the plank, a ripple that traveled underfoot and up through the frame. The boards never rested. Every strike of the gun, every dropped hammer, every shift of a crate sent vibrations through the floor. The men learned to read these signals, a plank that buzzed too long after a strike, a bounce that did not settle, a rattle that grew sharper as the day wore on. They adjusted their stance, spread their weight, and kept their tools close. When the gang moved, they moved together, never crowding one spot for long. Too many boots in one place, and the board could dip, even crack, turning a synchronized step into a sudden drop. The danger was not just in numbers. The planks responded to the smallest changes, a gust of wind, a sudden downpour, or the simple act of one man shifting his balance. On cold mornings, frost made the wood slick, and every footfall had to be measured. In summer, heat dried out the boards, making them brittle. The rhythm of the gang, hammer, catch, brace, drive, kept the work moving. But it also amplified the strain on every piece of wood beneath them. Each man trusted not only his own balance, but the timing of his crew. If one lost the beat, the load could spike, and the plank might not forgive the mistake. Newsreel footage from 1929 shows the crews moving in this tight formation, their bodies leaning into the work, never pausing for long. The choreography was more than habit, it was survival. The boards did not care about experience or skill. They responded only to weight and vibration. For the men on the inside, every shift was a dance with the floor itself, a test of how well they could match their own rhythm to the living, shifting platform beneath their boots. January 1929 delivered a test no blueprint could predict. Ice storms swept across Manhattan, and the Chrysler building's skeleton became a trap for cold and fatigue. On the unfinished floors, a glaze nearly an inch thick coated every surface, steel beams, ladders, and most dangerously, the patchwork of wooden planks that served as floors. NOAA records from that winter confirmed 0.8 inches of ice built up over 3 days, enough to transform each board into a slick, unpredictable hazard. The temperature hovered below freezing, so even the smallest movement sent a shiver through the wood, making every step a calculation. Work didn't pause. Schedules pressed on, and crews bundled in wool coats and leather gloves shuffled across the frozen decks, boots searching for grip on boards that now flexed and creaked under the added weight of ice. The planks, already worn from weeks of use, soaked up moisture and grew heavier, their fibers swelling and losing strength. Oak that once felt solid began to groan underfoot. Pine, always a compromise, became especially treacherous. A tap with a hammer no longer told the whole story. Hidden splits and frost worked together, weakening the core from within. Even experienced men who could read the wood by feel found themselves second-guessing each crossing. Wind gusts funneled through the open frame, sometimes strong enough to lift a loose plank or rattle a stack of boards left for the next shift. A sudden blast could send a board skittering across the steel, or worse, catch a worker off balance. Oral histories describe near misses, a Rivet gang heater slipping and catching himself by the edge, another man tumbling through a gap but landing on a lower beam, battered but alive. In these conditions, fatigue was more than tired muscles. It was a fog that dulled reflexes and turned routine into risk. The danger was not just in the height, but in the invisible hand of the weather, multiplying every flaw in the system. No rulebook accounted for ice. There were no extra inspections, no pause for the storm to pass. The city's code was silent on how much weight a frozen plank could bear, or how wind might pry up a board wedged in haste. The only certainty was that the environment itself could tip the balance from safe passage to sudden failure. For the men inside, the greatest threat was not the skyline outside, but the way winter seeped into the wood beneath their boots, turning the familiar floor into a shifting, silent adversary. Official records for the Chrysler building's construction list 5 men lost to the work. Yet in the same breath, contemporary newspapers, most notably the Daily News, claimed the toll was nearly 3 times higher. 14 dead, some named, most just numbers in a grim column. Both figures circulate today, each with its own shadow. The truth sits somewhere between the ledgers and the headlines, obscured by missing accident logs, vanished coroner files, and the silence of a workforce that seldom spoke for itself. No full list of the dead survives. There are no surviving coroner dockets in the city's archives for most of 1929, and the Department of Buildings accident ledgers from those years are either missing or incomplete. What remains are fragments, a union name here, a police report there, a family's memory pieced together from an old photograph or a brief obituary. The divide between the official count of 5 and the claimed 14 is more than a clerical error. It is a reflection of what the era chose to count and what it chose to ignore. Contractors had every reason to keep their numbers low. A clean safety record meant faster insurance payouts, less scrutiny from city officials, and a reputation for efficiency. Newspapers, chasing headlines, sometimes inflated the toll or relied on second-hand reports. Workers who fell through a plank might be listed as careless or unlucky. Their deaths quietly filed away as the cost of progress. For most, there was no memorial, no plaque. The men who vanished through those makeshift floors became part of the building's invisible foundation. Their stories are missing from the grand opening speeches and the glossy photographs of the spire. The real danger of the Chrysler building wasn't the wind at the crown or the dizzying view from the top. It was the silent risk beneath each boot, the ordinary board that could give way without warning, and the lives that disappeared without record. The courage that built the skyline wasn't just about standing tall against the sky. It was the quiet faith that the next step, unseen and uncounted, would hold. Every morning before the first rivet was fired, the foreman made his rounds with a hammer in hand. This was the tap test, a ritual passed down from job to job, never written in any manual. He'd strike each board, listening for the sharp ring of solid oak or the dull thud that warned of hidden rot or a split deep in the grain. On a bad day, the hammer's echo told him more than any building code. If a plank sounded hollow, he'd drag a stick of red chalk from his pocket and scrawl an X across the wood. That mark meant retirement, at least in theory. In practice, a board marked for discard might linger for days, especially if new lumber was slow to arrive or if the schedule pressed. Foremen trusted their ears and their instincts more than any rulebook. The city's code offered little guidance, so crews invented their own safeguards. There was the 3-foot rule: never let the ends of 2 planks line up over open air. Always stagger them so a single crack could not run the length of the floor. Men learned to spot a board that bounced too much or to avoid a knot that had started to split. Sometimes a plank was wedged tight with a spike or a scrap of wood, but more often it was just habit and caution that kept disaster at bay. Trade journals of the era ran columns with advice for site safety, but the real rules were unwritten and enforced by the foreman's word. Some crews kept a tally in a battered notebook, which boards had been marked, which had survived a week of heavy loads, which had been tapped and cleared to climb another floor. But the ledger was only as good as the time allowed to keep it. The pace of work meant shortcuts were common, and the tap test was as much a gesture of hope as a guarantee. These grassroots checks were all the men had. There were no harnesses, no formal inspections, just a daily negotiation with the planks beneath their boots. The courage that made it into photographs was only half the story. The other half was quieter, a foreman's practiced ear, a red chalk X, and the silent trust that the next step would hold. The story of the Chrysler building is told through photographs: men perched on spires, boots balanced on beams, the city stretching far below. These images, printed in newspapers and hung in museums, built the legend of the fearless high steel worker, risk written in the wind, heroism measured by altitude. Yet the truth lay out of sight where no camera lingered. The real peril was not the edge of the steel but the floor beneath, a shifting patchwork of planks hidden inside the unfinished tower. Photo archives from the late 1920s are dominated by exterior shots. John A. Meyer's black and white prints, the Library of Congress negatives, and the famous Bettman aerials all focus on the spectacle: silhouettes against the sky, men straddling the crown. These images traveled the country, shaping the public memory of skyscraper construction as a dance with gravity, a contest between man and the void. What they rarely showed was the interior, the dim, echoing shell where the risk was not dramatic but ordinary, lurking in the boards that looked solid until they gave way. Media institutions favored what the eye could see and what the lens could frame. The drama of height was easy to capture. The danger of a loose plank was not. Even trade journals in their rare interior shots tended to crop the frame to the action, not the floor. The result was a kind of collective blindness, the myth of the skyscraper worker as daredevil, unafraid of heights, took hold, while the daily reality, men moving across unstable reused boards, trusting balance and routine, faded into the background. This gap between image and experience shaped how the era remembered its builders. The courage celebrated in photographs was only half the story. The real test was not just standing tall above Manhattan, but stepping forward on a floor that might not hold every shift, every day. The hidden danger was the one no one thought to picture, yet it claimed more lives than the wind ever could. By 1931, the dangers faced inside the Chrysler building had become impossible to ignore among contractors, unions, and city officials. The city's building code, silent on the specifics of temporary wooden planks for years, finally received an amendment. For the first time, the law required that every temporary floor in a steel frame building be inspected and signed off by a licensed engineer before work could continue above. The amendment, added as Section 923 in the 1931 supplement, called for a certified inspection of each deck and encouraged the use of metal decking wherever possible, a direct response to the hidden hazards exposed by the Chrysler project and others like it. This was more than paperwork. Now, before a crew could move upward, a stamped certificate had to be filed on site, confirming that each plank met the new minimum grade. Select hard cure oak, not just whatever the yard had in stock. The requirement did not end the use of wood overnight, but it put formal eyes on a danger that had previously been left to the instincts of a foreman and the luck of the crew. At the same time, the industry began to pivot. The Empire State Building, already underway, became the first major skyscraper in New York to specify metal decking in its contract documents. Corrugated steel replaced timber on every floor above the 15th, creating a rigid, uniform surface that could be inspected, rated, and trusted in a way no plank ever could. Trade journals from 1931 noted a sharp drop in plank-related injuries on sites that adopted this system, an 80% reduction, according to the Steel Contractors Association's annual report. These changes did not erase the risks overnight, but they signaled a new era. The invisible threat of the shifting plank was no longer just the private worry of a Rivet gang. It had become a matter of public record, stamped and signed, woven into the blueprints of the city's next generation of towers. Still today, the greatest hazards on work sites rarely make headlines. They hide in the ordinary, overlooked details. Regulations now exist, but construction workers everywhere still trust each plank, each step, to hold. The true courage of those who built our skylines lies not in daring the heights, but in risking the invisible. Every structure's legacy isn't just steel and glass. It is the quiet gamble in every footstep. Thanks for watching, and share your thoughts below.